there was an obvious opportunity with COP26 coming potentially in November of this year as originally intended, that there was going to be a push on it on the green investment side. I think now that COVID's happened, we've got a chance to build a far cleaner, a more resilient economy.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academia from all over the world, and it will explore the hottest topics across the energy market. It'll be hosted by various experts from Aurora and will give a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora. And on the show today, we'll be discussing how the UK's largest utility is thinking about what the UK needs to do as we come out of COVID-19 to get the economy going and to decarbonise the energy system. My guest today is the CEO of SSE PLC, Alistair Phillips-Davies. Welcome, Alistair.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much for having me.
And Alistair, many will know, is I think the longest serving utility exec in the UK, or certainly listed utility exec in the UK, and probably one of the longest serving in Europe, I would say. Probably not quite the longest, but the Southern European CEOs seem to be in place for a while, but among the longest serving.
Well, hopefully I'm still feeling young and don't tell my new chairman as and when we select him, just in case he wants to get rid of me or change me, because I'm quite enjoying life at the moment.
Oh, good. I was going to say, I mean, you've been in the role since 2013, and it was, I suppose that's 7 years, which is long for CEOs. But given what's happened in that period of time, you've clearly done a pretty good role in navigating things because not everyone has fared as well in a challenging time, I think. Before this, Alistair had a distinguished career in business. He's been at SSE for a long time, and probably less well known, he was a university darts champion as an undergrad. Do you still play darts, Alistair?
Not very often, it's fair to say. But I don't go to pubs much. Clearly not at the moment. But if I saw a set and had an opportunity, then maybe next time I'm in Oxford, we'll go down the pub and I'll bring some darts with me.
Yeah, excellent. Well, you're no doubt better than me at darts. And because you were captain of your darts team at university? Was it and some captains are there for skill, so sort of Joe Root type thing, and some are there because of leadership, maybe Michael Vaughan type thing. Were you there for skill or for leadership? Was it an early signal of your leadership ability then? Or was it all skill?
Possibly. I played. I did play in one of the varsity matches against Oxford, and I was treasurer as well for a period of time. So I wasn't the strongest, but I was a decent one. I wasn't the last player up, and I wasn't the first player up generally.
Okay, interesting. It sounds like the leadership category possibly. Great. So can I get into the first thing I want to talk about is this Greenprint that SSE has recently published for decarbonisation, which I assume is a bit like a blueprint, but for decarbonisation. Can I ask why have you chosen now to release it? And the context for me is I've always seen SSE as a company that probably engaged less in the public debates, less than Centrica, less than some of the other utilities. Why did you feel like now was a time for SSE to put a stake in the ground?
I think we'd always intended to produce something, and colleagues were in the process of drafting our sort of net zero transition plan. We did our transmission business plan, which is essentially a network for net zero, and on top of that, it was obvious that there was going to be more and more things coming along. So sort of even in a run up to January, February this year, when we had a clear result at the general election, it seemed like there was an obvious opportunity with COP26 coming potentially in November of this year as originally intended, there was going to be a push on it on the green investment side. I think now that COVID's happened, we've got a chance to build a far cleaner, a more resilient economy. It's obvious. I think our workers and a lot of others across the industry have done a huge job in keeping the lights on and everything else, and that's really important to fundamentally how society works. Trying to live without electricity, I think, would be very difficult for all of us. But now that we've also got a huge challenge in terms of bringing the economy back, we felt now was the right point in the cycle to come out with this. It seems other people are talking about these sort of things. The opportunity, one, to invest, to attract relatively low-cost funding from markets, to basically create more jobs in the economy directly in our company and similar companies, and also to build more resilient local supply chains, not excluding other people, but I think resilience is going to be important going forward. All of those things were there, and ultimately it's clear to us that investments in low-carbon infrastructure are a real win-win right now.
Great. And do you get the sense, given where we are, and as you say, there are a lot of people who are making similar sounds, I think, of sort of, a green recovery, governments talking about building back better. Do you think government's making the right moves at the moment to get on with this type of thing, or would you have liked to see more, or in particular areas?
I think government's obviously had a huge job on its plate to sort out the current crisis, and everybody seems to be an expert on healthcare and all sorts of things. But we have seen, I think, a clear signal from government that they're interested in this. COP26 is still coming here at the end of 2021. I think there was an article on the FT earlier this week from the Chancellor signalling these sort of things. He was talking, going back to the £800 million that might be there for CCUS and hydrogen. We've got government pushing forward, I think, with the CFD auctions and everything else. So they've got a wide range of policy instruments that are getting ready to go. I just think we thought it was a time to signal that we, and hopefully the rest of the industry, are ready to have that conversation as we look to exit from the lockdown and live with COVID going forward, and make sure that we can generate really good, substantial new jobs for people up and down the country.
Mm. And it seems to me, having read it, it's a pretty broad document. As you say, there's the networks, there's heat, there's generation, there's storage. It's a sort of thing really only SSE has the footprint to have been able to produce in the UK context. Was it a deliberate choice to be broad and sort of whole of system, or were you essentially reflecting SSE's footprint?
I think we wanted to be broad. We wanted to be whole of system. I think it's interesting that, and you see this during the current crisis, that when people pull together and in the same direction, there's an awful lot that we can achieve. And I think it's important that there's a lot of our businesses in there, a lot of opportunities for businesses that we're certainly involved with. But I think it's about the energy industry as a whole pulling together. That's why we're able to maybe call it a Greenprint, and to look across that whole industry, talk about all sorts of things. Roll out of electrification to transport. We're not a car manufacturer, but there are clearly opportunities to roll out charging infrastructure. I think hydrogen's going to have a growing and important role. That's further out over the next decade. We're obviously going to see huge opportunities in transportation and heat for electricity to play a role. And there are all sorts of areas, whether it's decarbonisation of thermal, or whether it's building more and more of what we've managed to get down to a very low cost for wind, which is obviously providing huge amounts of a generation at the moment. So I think the opportunity to create a really strong partnership between industry and government is important, and that's what we wanted to talk about. And we were giving government the opportunity to signal back to the industry what it is that they're interested in and what it is that they really want to work on.
Yeah. And are you getting a sense? I mean, do you talk to car manufacturers? Do you talk to others? Do you get the sense that this is the type of document proposal, people could start to fall behind. Maybe not exactly the document others would have produced, but as a way of building consensus. And I suppose related to that, do you think a lot of the investment for implementing some of the things you're planning can come from the private sector?
Yeah, so a few questions there. So we obviously talk to a lot of people associated with this, supply chain people, car manufacturers. I think what we saw was generally an interest in it. I think we've seen support from it, even from one to other industry companies as well, cautiously adopting some of the positions that we've taken there to make people think. So I think it's got a lot of really good traction in terms of what we've seen. It was meant as a thought piece. We're not saying we know everything and everything is right, but what we wanted to do was make sure that we put out something that looks close to the opportunity to go for a whole system solution. And I think to your point, I believe there is a lot of money that could be invested here. I think international funds, if the policy is right in countries, and the UK's had a long history of attracting a lot of investment into the utilities and infrastructure sector for the last 30 years plus, then I think with the right policies, the right tweaks to what we've got currently, there's an opportunity to get a lot more money coming in, because people will see that this is a growing business. This is a business that has a real future, has a real resonance with the public and voters in terms of where they want to take it. So yeah, it seems the time to be looking at this and getting on with it, and it solves a big problem in society, that we still have a climate emergency, but it can also help us out of some of the issues that we'll have around the economy and jobs.
Yeah. So just to drill into a few specific elements of the Greenprint, offshore wind is central. Why is, I suppose given recent history, government's obviously very supportive. You're probably pushing on an open door there, but, offshore wind, I think the perception is it's more expensive than onshore wind. Solar declines are coming. Why is it so bullish? Why is the Greenprint so bullish on offshore wind?
Well, I think we've seen offshore wind. It's the cheapest scalable technology out there at the moment. So I think it's an excellent fit for the industry. In the UK, we've invested over a long period of time, whether it was ROCs, double ROCs, CFDs, in policy mechanisms that are attracted there. I suspect this is the biggest offshore wind market in the world. Currently, it's certainly the most developed. We've still got an awful lot of seabed and offshore opportunities there. We're sort of close to Europe, so there's opportunities if you build supply chain here that you could feed into the European North Sea scene as well. So it looks like the UK has genuine comparative advantage there. So the opportunity to create jobs is huge, and even in these incredibly difficult and challenging times, particularly with lower prices and things of that nature, we've obviously seen Seagreen get away this week. We found a co-investor there. That'll create 400 plus jobs, and there's potentially £1 billion of value add to Scotland coming out of that project, plus across the UK as a whole. We see 50% of the cost of that project coming from a sort of UK based supply chain, which is something that we obviously want to improve on going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. So offshore is kind of pitched as this export industry in a sense, and yet SSE's strategy so far seems to have been around domestic offshore, and SSE focuses GB and Ireland. Could you ever see this, and this gets a little bit to corporate strategy, could you see SSE playing a bigger role in the global offshore wind industry and making that part of the UK's exports in the same way as some of the other Europeans are?
I think I could. I mean, obviously the UK at the moment, we've got a potential commitment of 40 gigawatts of offshore by 2030. So the opportunities here are huge. Yeah, we're obviously calling for more ambition to continue our leadership position, but then we're the only entirely UK headquartered company that's acting strongly in this market at the moment. So we have almost an obligation to lead as a national champion in this area and help build that supply chain. And as we see, there are many other countries in Europe that are doing similar things with auctions, it does give us the opportunity to look overseas and hopefully we'll, be able to drag along some of the supply chain that's done so well in the UK as well, and get them to feed in, at the least to that very close North Sea market and possibly further afield.
Would you, so on this, would you draw any parallels to hydrogen and CCS? So the Greenprint, espouses support for these technologies. They're obviously far less developed than, or far less mature than offshore wind. But you cited the SSE experience of double rocks and CFDs, all the while driving costs down. Do you see parallels in terms of cost declines for hydrogen and CCS? Can we have much confidence about this?
Well, if I look back on our experience in the in the offshore market when we first built Greater Gabbard, which was kicked off in 2008, 2009, and then was completed 2010, 11 time. Essentially, the cost didn't really probably come down for the first 5 years or so in that, and it's only been in the last few years that we've seen that acceleration. So I think when you're building very, very big, heavy infrastructure, the offshore wind market to tell you maybe need to go at it for 10 years to get the real significant drops. We've certainly seen plants around the world in the CCS area. I think we're doing a lot of work now along the East Coast, looking at the various clusters that we're looking to put together, industrial clusters for both generation and ultimately industrial processes to be low carbon. And I think there are opportunities to do that. But right now, we need to access the funds that government are potentially committed to. We need to have a couple of sites going. I think particularly on the CCUS side, that can happen over the next few years. I think it'd be really good to get something with a bunch of UK input and a really good strong partnership, maybe one or at least one and maybe two ready to be announced at COP26 next year. And I would really, really push on that. And I think we can see prices that are comparable with other sort of technologies, not yet ready to compete with wind, but it does have the ability to be flexible that neither of the other major low carbon technologies are at the moment.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about domestic supply chain there, and that's something that comes through in the SSE document. What does that do to? So I'm thinking of global Britain and post Brexit and engaging with the rest of the world. So I suppose does the focus on the local supply chain send a message that's inconsistent with government policy, do you think? And I suppose just out of interest, what does local content do to your costs? Were you to say, right, we're going to source this from whoever can give us the highest quality at the cheapest price, would that fundamentally change the cost of, say, offshore wind for SSE?
I think that's where we sit at the moment, actually, John. You're in a straight auction. As you can tell, that the last auction round cleared it, around the £40 mark. The previous one, not that much earlier, was £57.50. So obviously we've knocked 25% off the price, basically, to get down there or pretty close to that. And to do that, you've had to go out there and just favour the lowest cost options. I do think, though, issues like we've had recently show that having a more resilient supply chain may mean less reliance on complete global sourcing. I think you've got to use the best of what's out there. You don't want to be precluding people, but I think it'll be important as we try and build more jobs and more local content and actually an industry that can go forward. How do we attract the investment into that supply chain? Does government have to think about having some, not complete, but some preconditions about more localized supply chain? How also do you measure the carbon footprint of those supply chains? How do we look at methodologies for measuring that going forward that might level up those playing fields? I think on this, ultimately, I'd favour across industry government, some sort of task force to have a look at it and really clarify what's wanted. Because I think we're often found being, please be the cheapest at the start, and then as soon as you win anything, everybody's trying to retrofit a whole bunch of other policies from other government departments on top of what you've had, and that, it just makes it more difficult to get these things off the ground. But they're all valid points. But I think we need a proper conversation about it.
Yeah, and that is not unprecedented. I mean, the Dutch offshore auctions were competitive. That's a floor price, and the prices went to zero. And then the government policy was, well, we're not going to go negative, but we're going to basically decide who we want to win at that point if everyone's at zero. So it essentially becomes a bit of a tender in that respect.
Yeah.
And they do favour local content, as I understand it. Good. So we've talked a bit about generation. We've talked about hydrogen, CCS, offshore wind, among other areas. I'd like to focus a little bit on networks. You've advocated, I don't want to get into this in too much detail, local area energy plans. One aspect of this that I find very interesting is electric vehicle charging. So you often hear there's this sort of chicken and egg problem. People don't want to buy EVs because they've got range anxiety and concern about charging. The distribution networks can't, or the transmission networks for that matter, can't build the charging infrastructure because there need to be EVs on the grid to justify it with Ofgem. What do you? And you appear to be advocating basically solving this by getting the charging infrastructure out in front of demand for EVs. What gives you confidence that will drive the rise and uptick in electric vehicle use?
Look, you're right on the chicken and egg piece here, but I do think we run the risk of falling into the trap of broadband, which is not the place we want to be. Where you've got patchy service and a public who probably rightly had some disappointments with how that was dealt with, and obviously we can see right now how important broadband is to all of us, for those of us who are working from home or have been working from home. So I think this is an area where you can really drive investment. You've got a couple of cycles of car changes to get people used to this. It's clear the manufacturers are bringing out more and more models. There was more came out this year, which is why I tried something different. Next year, there's going to be an awful lot more again. So I think the opportunity there is very, very large. If we want to, decarbonize a whole bunch of transport and personal vehicles are the one where you'd start rather than heavy goods vehicles. So for me, rolling out the infrastructure, you can have private and regulated network models. We see that in network regulation as it stands currently. You've got private gas, private electricity networks coexisting with heavily regulated ones. But I think there needs to be a clear fallback on those regulated networks. They have pretty low cost of capital, as we're seeing at the moment, and generally they deliver a good service. And so I think it's really, really important that we take that opportunity to drive that change, and we can build essentially a world-class network around the UK over the next 5 to 10 years, and really drive a massive change in this, drive up electricity consumption and significantly drive down the carbon footprint of the country, mm-hmm. which is all of which I think is really, really important, which is why we said bringing forward the end of the new petrol and diesel sales by 2030 seems to us to be eminently achievable and very certainly worth a strong debate.
Yeah, okay. But obviously you need the infrastructure there in advance if you're going to do this. Oh, on the network price controls. So that's coming up. We need a resolution on that coming up. You talk a bit about both the transmission and the distribution. How important and time sensitive is T2, the T2 price control, which concerns transmission? Which is it just about confirming a rate of return? What are the aspects that you would like to see move forward more quickly?
So I think there are probably three critical aspects that I'd call out. There's definitely the one about the ambition for investment. So just with what is currently the smallest transmission network that we have in the north of Scotland, we're talking about a 2.4 billion spend programme a certain 2.4 billion spend program. That would rise to just over 3 billion if the Viking wind farm on Shetland goes ahead. Within our document, A Network for Net Zero, we had close to 7 billion of projects there if people were looking to accelerate. A lot of these projects, certainly the 3 billion, are shovel-ready projects that can go with very, very substantial local content in them, and will significantly add to our ability to deploy low carbon infrastructure across the UK. I suspect across the transmission networks as a whole, you can have way north of 10 billion of shovel-ready projects. The second piece, as you rightly say, is returns. How do we get a fair return? I think we all know and accept that returns are going to go down. It's just how far down. I think we are at risk of missing our opportunity here. If returns go down too far, people will not like them. We'll see risks. We'll end up with a sector in the same place as the water sector, with good companies disagreeing with the regulators about how it should go forward, and that'll clearly risk destroying confidence in the investment case. So we need fair returns, and some of those fair returns go to the risks. If people want, and we believe this country wants and needs, more innovation, and sort of looking at things in a different way, taking risks on things in order to get costs down, then you have to encourage people to invest in some way, shape or form. So anticipatory investment, which I think now we've definitely seen the regulator talk about it. It was a difficult one, I think, last year. This year, with a new chief executive there coming in and launching quite heavily into net zero on his first day in office. I think anticipatory investment certainly there, and you can liken those things to investing in manufacturing vaccine facilities. Those things will take 12, 18 months to put together. If we wait and see what vaccine it is and then manufacture the facility to do it, that's one thing. If you anticipate that and manufacture the 3, 4, 5 big types of facilities you need, you are risking maybe a few $1 billion, but your chances of generating hundreds of millions of vaccines, once you have one that is successful quickly, is rapidly improved. People have to make the decisions about whether those are the sort of things they want, and it's very, very similar in our business. We need to encourage investment that's innovative, that does take some calculated risks to try and really change things and make things better, and get us to net zero by 2040 in line with what we're proposing.
And why, just to follow up on that, why is the investment requirement that large? Is that large compared to history? And is this driven by decarbonisation? You talked about the Shetland island offshore. Is this about integrating renewables for the most part?
Yeah, that's the bulk of it. You essentially had a network that 20 or 30 years ago would have been focused on taking power from coal fields, where you essentially had coal stations built on top of the coal fields or very close to the coal fields, and distribute them around the country. Now you're going to have a network that's far more about some onshore to some extent, so picking up from sort of remote high wind onshore sites, but particularly offshore sites, so particularly along the east coast of the UK, up around the north coast as well, and then taking that power and bringing it into the big population centres. You've also got the issue about what's the balance on the system as we go forward and we see more renewable penetration. You'll need more technical bits of kit in there to support voltage and provide stability and other things of that nature, basically. So it is a mini industrial revolution happening within the energy sector, but we've got the opportunity to get ahead of everybody else, build up our low carbon infrastructure now, invest for it now, export a lot of those skills later when other countries take that up around the world, and just put us in a much better position as well going forward, having already done that.
Yeah, and to me at least, it's one of the less well appreciated aspects of the energy transition is that renewables are cheap, but copper is still pretty expensive. And when we're talking about these 70, 80, 90%, 100% renewable systems, getting the power to market is just, we don't see it yet, because it's easy for the first few wind farms, but it becomes a big challenge. Could I ask on that? So one challenge might be, well, hang on, copper is expensive. Do we need all of this copper? Don't we have software and batteries and ways to manage congestion that don't involve billions of pounds in capital outlay now? Can we get people in the Shetlands to turn up their hydrogen electrolysis, or can we get people in London to turn down their freezers or something like that as a substitute for building more wires?
And look, certainly on the distribution side, just building lots of new wires isn't what we want to do. We want to be able to utilise more smartly, exactly as you said, what we've got, and I think that'll be a really interesting part of the ED2 business plan. I think towards the end of ED2, depending on the rollout, particularly things like electric vehicles, electric heating, you may have to put more in there. If we look at things like the CCC report, they're talking about a doubling or doubling plus of energy consumption. You're not going to ship twice as much energy by the time you get into 2040s through the same wires. You will have to at some point do deeper upgrades of wires, but there is no doubt that you need to look at those local zones. So we deal with 16 local authorities. We've got over 60 meetings sort of penciled in with them to go through a clear process to try and look at what their plans are, and to be able to plan out, well, when do we put the sensors in? How do we establish where the pinch points are? Is it cheaper to put in battery storage? How do we get services from the local community that are actually there to provide things? And yeah, you absolutely want to exhaust all those things before you just, suddenly, as you say, go laying copper or aluminium down the roads to do that. But at some point, you're going to have to do some of that as well if we're going to see the same amount of if we're going to see such a huge growth in the amount of energy going down there. I mean, fortunately, you can reconductor a lot of these things, but all of that does take work. And I think all we've got to recognise, John, is that this is a 20-year program. What are the things that we can really pick off over the next decade, which is what we're focusing on here. And also, I think we've got to acknowledge that government isn't going to have a lot of money, which is why we need to attract money from private sources, if at all possible, so it doesn't cost, it's not costing the public purse. And then secondly, that jobs issue, which of these sort of things gives the best bang for buck in terms of generating more indigenous jobs to support the economy?
Yeah, just briefly on that, you said your projects are shovel ready. Let's just say T2 signed off 2.4 billion spend program. How quickly can you get people working on those projects? Is it within 3 months? Is it within 2 years? Just from a stimulus perspective.
So for the 2.4, probably for something just over 3 billion, and we were actually going around this internally yesterday, we have plans in place so that we'll recruit up to the level that we can deliver from the 1st of April next year. We could deliver that through a 3 billion plus program. If it went a lot more than 3 billion, and that's perfectly possible, as I said, there's at least as much again there, then we'd have to be working harder at doing that. And that's why we want to have the discussions now. I'm sure that's also true at the other two big transmission operators, Grid and SP.
Yeah. Okay. So there's another potential tension in the Greenprint that I see, which is around so you've advocated net zero in the power system by 2040, which, I mean, at least from my perspective, is the year that's basically consistent with Paris. If GB is going to be net zero by 2050, well, the power system should probably be about a decade ahead. But you're building the newest CCGT plant on the system, combined cycle gas turbine, which is positive carbon emissions. And now, presumably, you're expecting that to last more than 20 years. How do they square? How do you square them, the plan and the investment in Keadby 2?
Yeah, look, I think that's a good question. I think there are two elements to it. One, there's a transition. So taking off the system, the far higher carbon emitting, far less efficient plant is important, and that'll be that's definitely going to be the most efficient plant in Europe. And it's also going to be pretty flexible as well. The ramp rates on it look flexible. I won't quote any of them now because us and Siemens will no doubt be testing those hard over the next year or so. But we expect that ultimately to be the most efficient and one of the most flexible plants around. It's in a great location in terms of that eastern zone for looking at carbon capture and storage. We're a key member with a number of other very big industry players at looking at carbon capture and storage over there. We've got a lot of room on the Keadby site, and whether it's Keadby 2 or even a Keadby 3 that you develop as a fully capture done piece of kit that'll be down, at less than 50 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour emissions. I think is that's a moot point. Equally, we're looking with technology providers like Siemens at over the next decade, how do you get to 20-30% hydrogen burning, then maybe 70, then maybe 100%, by changing the burners, changing compressors and things like that. So it has a lot of retrofitability to it, which is probably not a proper word, but hopefully you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And that's where we've got to be. So our thermal business is very clear. It only has a future in our group and a future for funding if it has a clear path to net zero. And while all the technology isn't there today, we clearly see routes for getting there, and we're putting investments and teams together, one on the CCUS side, and secondly on the hydrogen burning technology side. And I'd be surprised if Humber or Teesside and therefore one of the ones close to that power station doesn't hopefully win something if we get a couple of projects going on that side of the country, and we get an opportunity to then really show what we can do with that piece of kit. So I think it helps in the short term, but I think it's hopefully more future proofed and more forward looking than people might think on the face of it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, and I suppose 50 grams a kilowatt hour, that compares to about 500 for unabated. So it's so you're getting rid of most of the carbon with that retrofit.
Yeah.
Good. There's no nuclear in the Greenprint. Why not? So this is a big part of government strategy. It obviously delivers a large amount of zero carbon electricity to Great Britain at the moment. Why didn't you include it?
So we're not a nuclear generator. I think we have a lot less knowledge there. As you say, government clearly think it has a role to play. It's probably, they've placed one enormous bet on a £20 billion first asset there that has yet to come through. Hopefully it will. As I say, I think it's got a role to play. But for us, if you look at what we've done, Offshore has come in there and blown it away in terms of costs. And equally, I think we can get CCUS and possibly hydrogen there as well, as being entirely competitive, but obviously rather more flexible. So while it's part of the mix, I don't think it's the answer for everything. It's not our area of expertise, and I think we need to focus on the real renewables that can generate huge amounts and at far, far lower proven costs, and also start to look at the far more flexible bits of kit that the system's going to need as well, which we think can be cost competitive. And we'll certainly be working hard to try and demonstrate that over the coming years. But particularly, I think as we run into COP26 next year, it seems like an ideal opportunity to showcase what the UK can do on carbon capture and storage.
Yeah. One other aspect of the Greenprint that I thought maybe didn't quite gel with SSE strategy or historical strategy possibly is the seems like there's a big reliance on CFDs and government contracts. I think at one point in there talks about CFDs not just for renewables but for repowering renewables, so ones that exist but perhaps extending the life, for storage. For low carbon, which I assume gas falls into that category. Is this I think there's a debate about the role of markets in the electricity system, but is this a sort of resignation that government's going to have a bigger role to play as a counterparty in getting us towards net zero?
Look, I think there's some interesting points, and when I reflect on government and roles to play, it's interesting at the moment that we've got a government that's probably been more interventionist than any government for possibly a century, two or more, in the economy generally, and I think we probably have to acknowledge that a little bit in our thinking. But if we go back to the specifics on the CFD, I think markets at a macro level have changed. We've seen really, really successful creation of offshore wind markets markets with initially ROCs and CFDs, and now auctions. And so I think the UK has to continue to want to be flexible as we evolve and go forward in what will be a very, very substantial change if we get to the 40 gigawatts by 2030, and but by then we'll be well past seeing no coal, and we'll have very, very little CCGT, I suspect, that isn't unabated or in some way running on a bit of hydrogen and other things. So I just see this market evolving, and as you see more and more support mechanisms in there, I think you just need to be careful that you're not seeing stranded costs for some things, and you're continuing to bring investors into that market. So given the success that we've had with these instruments, I think we need to continue to move them forward and try and make sure that as the system heads towards net zero, and it's more difficult to get a price for carbon in the energy sector, and indeed it's more difficult to know in a world where you've got low marginal costs how you're going to set the price for energy, that we continue to look at how we evolve the market to give investors the confidence to grant capital for building these assets and building more assets at a very, very low rate. I think confidence in the market is important. That generates the low funding costs, and that'll perpetuate lower costs for consumers ultimately. So it's how you get that right. At the moment, I think is the right time, given how long these market structure debates tend to go on for, to start having that debate once we're clear about what the ambition is, and I'm very much hoping that this government and this country will be really ambitious about what it does on the green economy.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. I mean, to some extent, what I've heard there, which I think if you've been through the market design discussions of the last decade, is we could waste half a decade redesigning the market when we've got tools that exist at the moment that seem to be working reasonably well.
Yeah, but I do. There's probably updates required. I think there is more thought required now to look out into 2030s and early 2040s, and what the overall system will look like, and what market designs are going to work to continue to encourage the outcomes that government want.
Yeah. Could I ask, that's not a bad segue. What I'd like to do at the end of the podcast is just ask you about a few concepts in our industry and ask you whether you think they're overrated or underrated. So I've got three concepts here, and the first one segues naturally from what we were just discussing. So the first concept is the role of markets in the future electricity system. Do you think the role of markets in the future electricity system is overrated or underrated?
Probably underrated. I think there's a clear need to encourage investment and sort of low cost investment where possible. So therefore, having clear rules and giving confidence. You're never going to have an energy market that's completely disassociated with politics, and therefore you need stable structures put in place over long periods of time. Markets get into trouble for all sorts of reasons. You only have to look at the machinations in, the oil and gas market following a little bit of a sort of playground tiff between Russia and Saudi Arabia that then gets exacerbated out of anybody's imagination of what might happen by COVID. So there's all sorts of things can happen, but I think markets are important, and understanding those markets and developing them properly, even in fairly heavily regulated businesses, but talk about competition in networks and things like that. And to an extent, that's right, but it's where networks can be regulated and where you can have competition in providing services and things of that nature. But certainly for the build of offshore wind, nuclear, CCUS, all of those need their priming, and CCUS needs its initial investment. But at the moment, it's very clear that wind's winning on the price front. Question then is how much baseload you need and how much flexibility do you need out of the thermal plant with CCUS on it. So the market structure is important there.
Yeah. And I mean, hydrogen seems like a very good example. It's sort of, someone needs to decide when to produce hydrogen via electrolysis, and someone needs to decide when to burn it in a power station, and prices are pretty good. Market prices are pretty good at telling people what to do. I'm not sure I'd be very confident if it was a central government saying when to do each of those things.
Yeah, and you need to create that market, because hydrogen probably looks better for sort of larger vehicles, about vans, trains, ships, things of that nature. If you want a low carbon fuel for those kind of heavy goods transport things, then electricity and massive battery packs may not be the best way to go.
Yeah. Okay, so the second concept is policy certainty. I think I know what you're going to say on this one, but policy certainty for power sector investments. Do you think policy certainty for power sector investments is overrated or underrated? And just because everyone always says it's underrated, I would just kind of slight premise here, I think, is that the private sector is often the first one to tell government when they've got something wrong and they should change a policy as well. So I every time someone says it's underrated, I slightly feel for government who are trying to sort of, in a very uncertain and fast moving world, change things, but not too much. But anyway, I didn't mean to preempt your answer.
Well, look, you guessed it right, first of all. But I think it's if you said consistency as well, that might be a good way of looking at it. I just think it is really important to have certainty and consistency. And we've seen right now, Sea Green was a more difficult process with only having a 40% CFD. Than we would have liked, because you see this huge crash in prices, so it makes buyers more nervous. So consistency of understanding what goes out is what drives lower cost of capital and brings people in, and then that gives lower costs for the industry over a period of time and makes consumers feel happier and ultimately politicians feel happier. So I think we don't want to be worrying about individual budgets affecting things. I think the long-term carbon price, which we've done this well not to harp on about too much so far doing this chat, is really, really important. I think this is about taking carbon out of the atmosphere or stopping emitting lots of it. So let's focus on the piece there. Getting the carbon price right and having certainty, but also consistency of how we're looking at it is important. And we're here making, they're not even 15-year investments. In reality, they're 25, 35-year investments. That's the reality of how long you're building these bits of kit for, or how long they're capable of running for. And so that is why I'm not sure you could ever do anything other than underrate it, really. But I'm not being critical of government about it. It's I think it's just a fact of life that we live with at the moment. That you always need to come back to that, and we should all be mindful of it.
Yeah. Okay, good. A final concept is the benefits of European power market integration. Do you people often talk about, Spanish solar and, Nordic hydro and integrating markets and trading and things like that. Do you think the benefits of European power market integration are overrated or underrated?
So I'll kind of put this in the middle. I'm not sure they're either, because it probably depends. Those people who go on about them, they've got to realise there are realities of individual country politics and how that plays out with other countries, no matter how integrated and unified the European Union may seem.
If the lights go out, the Prime Minister loses his job. So we're not going to trust the French, as trustworthy as they are.
I was advised before I came on the call not to make comments about prime ministers and presidents and things like that. So I may have to duck that one, John. But but look, you're 100% right. I think it's important that we have trading and that there is as much harmony and integration across the markets as possible, because it's going to lower costs and provide greater security of supply. But equally, you've got to be aware of exactly what you've said, which is there are political realities in all of this that mean interconnectors aren't really worth all they're cracked up to be worth at times. They can provide arbitrage, but when the chips are down, which way's the power flowing, basically, because chances are chips may be down on both sides. And I think that's important. But look, I would advocate for us trying to stay close to Europe, to build up a sensible amount of interconnection, and just figure out what we physically really need them for, how we really value them. But let's just acknowledge the real politic, which I think you put very nicely.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Well, that's a great point to conclude. So we've clearly got a lot to get on with as an industry, and thank you, SSE, I suppose, for laying out at least one version of how we might crack on with it. Alistair, thanks again for joining me today and sharing your expertise. It was a pleasure having you on.
Okay, no, that's great, John, and we hope to interact with you and anybody else who's got some views on this. This is about all of us building something really good and strong for the country, and we need to have all of us working together on it. So delighted to do it, and hopefully it sparks the right sort of debate.
Great, thanks, Alistair.
Cheers, John.
That was Aurora's Chief Executive and Co-Founder John Feddersen speaking to Alistair Phillips-Davies. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.